welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. This week, a number of high-profile leaders in Washington tested positive for COVID-19. They include, and it's a long list here, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Attorney General Merrick Garland, the Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, Senator Susan Collins, and Jamal Simmons, the Communications Director for the Vice President. And that's just some of them. All of this comes as Senate Republicans blocked a $10 billion COVID aid bill over their desire to keep Trump-era border restrictions in place. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Nia Malika Henderson, senior political analyst for CNN, and Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. Thank you, both of you, for being here. Jeff, we started talking about it a little bit in the show, but I want to get more into this. People around the president, people who the White House says weren't close contacts, but people who are clearly in his vicinity at the White House with him have come up with COVID. What's the feeling inside the White House about where things might go next?
Well, number one, they are certainly focusing on funding, which you mentioned in your intro just now, and that seems to be kind of their answer when they are pressed about what the next steps are with regard to COVID. But specifically on the cases around the president and in Washington, it's a concern. It's certainly a concern. Joe Biden is 79 years old. He is vaccinated. He is boosted. But we are seeing with these cases that are exploding right now, at least in Washington, that lots of people who are vaccinated and boosted are getting the virus. So it was interesting to me, and I mentioned this earlier, that they seem to be shifting and saying, yeah, the president might get it, while also sticking to their line broadly that they do have protections in place, that people are tested before they come to meet with him. He's getting tested regularly, but you don't see him wearing a mask. And he's been at multiple events this week where there are a lot of people. Today's, of course, was outdoors, but the others this week were indoors.
And Nia, as Jeff said, the president is double boosted. What's your sense, based on your reporting, about the White House and President Biden's their interest in trying to return to some sense of normalcy, especially given the politics of this?
Yeah, I mean, you can see by what they've been doing with not wearing the mask is that they have been concerned about this discourse that really, I think, permeates a lot of the conversation around the country when it comes to talking about COVID, talking about COVID restrictions. The thought among many Americans is that maybe Democrats have taken it too far, right? And that they have taken the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates too far. So you saw this White House react to this. And you see now that they haven't been wearing masks. The president went overseas, was, hugging babies and all sorts of stuff without a mask. And then he comes back to this country. Some people came back from that trip with COVID. And that's when I sort of started talking to people about concerns around the White House about what the policy was. Were they sort of following the policy? What the concerns were about whether or not the president would get it or other folks would get it. You saw Jen Psaki, for instance, get COVID as well. So there have been these concerns, and you see now the White House, Kate Bedingfield, who's the comms director, was on our air, CNN's air, essentially seeming to lay the groundwork for the likelihood that the president at some point could test positive for COVID. And what that will mean in terms of the politics of it, in terms of how he handles his job, that'll be something that the country and the White House will have to confront. But it certainly seems like they're sort of putting that expectation out there that he might have it. The other thing to point out in Washington is that we're sort of coming up towards party season in Washington. You had the Gridiron Dinner. There are other big parties where Washington will celebrate Washington that are coming up. So lots of decisions to be made about reporters going to these gatherings, and whether the White House will also allow President Biden to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. He didn't go to the Gridiron Dinner. It's probably a good thing that he didn't at this point, given that has turned out to be a super spreader event.
A super spreader event, and one that is proceeding. It's sort of the kickoff party to the Washington Celebrating Washington party. So there's a lot there. Jeff, I want to ask you, when it comes to the White House, they say that they're disappointed that this $10 billion COVID aid package was successfully blocked by Republicans. But what's the plan inside the White House to actually get this money? Do they think that it's going to be able to get? Do they think that they're going to be able to get this money?
Well, good question. They were not only disappointed that they didn't get the 10 billion, they were disappointed that the 10 billion was that figure instead of the 22.5 billion, which I believe was what they originally requested from Congress. They're not getting either right now, and they have continued to sound the alarm. I think that to answer your question, I think that will be the game plan going forward, is to sound the alarm. Hope perhaps that the fact that there are outbreaks sort of beginning now. This is not awesome, but it underscores, I think, from the White House's perspective, the need for that funding. You're also going to see Jeff Zients step aside. He's been the COVID coordinator, and the new doctor coming in will be a new face of the COVID response. So I imagine we'll start seeing him out on the airwaves and talking to the public and talking to the press about the need as well.
There's a lot to talk about there. We're definitely going to keep talking about COVID. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, though, Ivanka Trump, former President Trump's eldest daughter and a former senior advisor at the White House, testified before the January 6th committee. And this week, in an interview with the Washington Post, former President Trump said he wished he had joined the march to the Capitol on January 6th. As we remember, the president told people to march to the Capitol, but then himself went back to the White House and watched the Capitol attack on TV. Nia, I wonder if I'll start first with Ivanka, and then we'll get to the president and what he's saying, and the former president, what he's saying. Why do you think it's significant that Ivanka came in and talked? Lawmakers say that she was forthcoming. It seems that she didn't invoke any privilege there.
That's right, and she didn't have to be subpoenaed to get there, and she did it fairly willingly, fairly openly, according to the folks on that committee. We have seen people in the president's inner circle really fight and not want to come before that committee, so the fact that she did it quite significant, and she was very much there in the White House as the president, you were saying, was watching TV at different points and watching this unfold happily, by some accounts, as this violent attack on the Capitol unfolded. There he was, and Ivanka Trump knows what his state of mind was, knows what he was doing, knows who he was talking to, because remember, there is this huge gap in the phone logs in terms of who he was interacting with and who he was talking with on the phone. So she could be a very good witness in terms of helping this committee piece together what the president was doing for those hours and hours and hours as this was unfolding before our very eyes on television. I think initially when this committee was put together, there was a feeling that, oh, well, maybe their report wouldn't be, as credible because it wasn't going to be a bipartisan or fully bipartisan committee. But they have talked to hundreds of people at this point. There have been some, high-profile stonewalling by a number of people. But the fact that they got Ivanka Trump as well as Jared Kushner, who wasn't there, but certainly knows this president, certainly knows Ivanka Trump, certainly I'm sure has been filled in on some of the things that were happening that day, quite significant. And remember, they are sort of under the gun at this point because it could be that come November, Democrats aren't in control anymore, and so they won't have the same kind of convening and subpoena power around this, and they themselves could also start to be the targets of investigation. So they are really under some pressure to wrap this up, to get as many people to come in and give an account of what they know about that day.
And Nia, high-profile stonewalling is a term that you could coin and one that we will continue to use here. Because Jeff, I want to come to you because in talking about high-profile stonewalling, of course, there is the former President Trump speaking to the Washington Post, and he said, and I have to read it because he said, quote, "The Secret Service said I couldn't go. I would have gone there in a minute." Here is President Trump saying he wished he would have gone to people breaking into the U.S. Capitol. Jeff, we covered him together. Right. I mean, please tell us what's going on.
Yes, we did, Yamish. What's interesting to me about that interview is that it's not surprising. Of course, he wanted to go. And he even said that day that he was going to go, which, of course, didn't turn out to be true. I believe him when he says the Secret Service wouldn't let him. I'm sure that's probably true. But the other broader political point here is the fact that he's willing to say that now, a year and a half after the carnage that happened that day. just really underscores how he continues to reach out or to try to appeal to that base, that political base that was part of that day. I think it also throws Republican efforts to describe that as sort of a fringe day and fringe movement. I don't think it helps their argument there either. You know, if the former president of the United States is saying, "I wish I'd been there," instead of condemning what was an attack on the U.S. Capitol, it's pretty hard to paint that in a way that many Republicans have since then as a one-off and something that should not even be investigated the way it's being investigated now.
And Nia, weigh in here, and especially with the idea that there was the first acquittal, from my understanding, of a defendant charged in the Capitol riot. Here you had Matthew Martin of New Mexico. He argued that he thought police allowed him to come into the Capitol, and that argument worked. And now we have a defendant who had a plea deal and has withdrawn from that plea deal because at least he saw Matthew Martin get off. So you have people being acquitted, and you have the former president saying, "Man, I wish I would have gone there with them."
Yeah, and you're going to have all sorts of outcomes from the people who are being swept up in this massive investigation that the DOJ is undertaking. A lot of people, are focused also on Donald Trump and his criminality and what kind of exposure he has. What was so interesting about that interview is, on the one hand, he says he wishes he had gone, but then he sort of says it was a shame what happened, and also that Nancy Pelosi and Muriel Bowser should have stopped it. So he's all over the place. I mean, we do know that he has brought millions of his followers along with him into his delusional thinking about January 6th, about the 2020 election as well. And, reading that, we covered Donald Trump. We lived through the Donald Trump presidency, and sort of nothing is shocking. But it is shocking to hear him in such a delusional state of mind and possibly on the precipice of running for president again in 2024, maybe announcing that at some point in the near future, and possibly also being the front runner for that nomination. And if he gets that nomination, getting the vote of Mitch McConnell. I mean, this is, something that all kind of came together this week with that interview, as well as Mitch McConnell saying if Donald Trump wins, that of course he would vote for him. Apparently there's sort of no moral red line for Mitch McConnell. But listen, this is going to be ongoing, this investigation into what happened in January 6th. There are hundreds of people who are wrapped up in it and are going to be charged and tried, and their outcomes are going to be very different. And we'll, of course, have the former president downplaying what happened and also saying in some ways it was legitimate because he still believes that 2020 was stolen from him.
Yeah, well, this is all stuff that we're definitely going to have to keep talking about. Nia, you said nothing is shocking. That'll be where we leave it for today, because that might be the phrase that we're saying more than once. So we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Nia and Jeff for sharing your reporting and for joining us. And thank you all for watching and for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.